Well, welcome. My name is Kareem Tabsch. I'm the co-director of O Cinema, and we're so delighted to be bringing this special screening of Balloon this weekend for South Florida audiences. This would not be possible without the patronage and support of the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany in Miami. And so thank you for once again partnering with O Cinema and being a champion of not just film in general, but more specifically German film. We've had the opportunity to partner a couple of times in the past, and it's always been such a joyous opportunity for our patrons to see the wonderful breadth of German cinema, which is arguably among the best cinema in the world. So I'd like to welcome the Consul General, Mr. Siegel. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I guess a little background for those who are watching us is that initially this conversation was supposed to happen in person at our theater at O Cinema South Beach. And aside from dealing with all of the COVID-19 pandemic precautions and challenges, we are also dealing with South Florida weather that has been very unexpected lately. So alas, we're here on Zoom and we're making the best of it. I wonder if you could tell me, I'd love to just start chatting a little bit about just kind of, how German cinema has been such a wonderful kind of export for sharing the culture and history of Germany around the world.
Well, I think many European countries have a very good track record of their film industry, like France, Italy, and other countries, and Germany. I think this goes back, well, way to the 1950s, as there were still the black and white films. We had a number of popular films which were also exported. And going back even to the 1920s, in Germany, there was a growing film industry as well. And then I think one of the breakthrough things were in the 1960s, end of 1960s and 70s, with the so-called New German Film, with like Fassbender and sort of producers.
Herzog and
yeah, and similar. So the New German Wave, I think, was quite dominant in, at least in intellectual circles. It was not necessarily a very popular cinema. But then we had also a few films in the 1980s, which were more humorous and more sort of directed towards the general public. Like, I don't know whether you remember that one, Shoe of Manitou was one of those. And then, of course, after German unification, we also had a few remarkable films that also were eligible for sort of the Oscar nominations and so on. The Life of Others, for example, is one of the key stories about a similar topic that we're dealing with in this film, Balloon.
And it goes, it goes without saying, but to remind folks that, Germany has one of the most important film festivals in the world, the Berlinale. Each year at the beginning of the year really kind of is one of the top 3 film festivals in the world. It really sets the tone for the kind of films we see. And I say that because so much of what we do at O Cinema is a curated experience where the films we choose, they're not just whatever's coming out, we specifically choose it. And we pay quite a bit of attention to the films that are playing at Sundance and Toronto. But of course, the films that are playing at the Berlinale are super important and indicative of some of the best of global cinema. But today we're talking about a specific film, Balloon. So 2019 was the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, an occasion that I think is one of the most important in 20th century history, and many of us will remember. And in 2020 is the 30th anniversary of the reunification. And so we want to talk a little bit about that through the prism of the films we're showing. And we're hoping that folks are seeing this conversation after having seen the film. There's not going to be anything in the terms of spoilers, so don't worry. We want to talk kind of about the broader points that the film discusses. So you grew up in West Germany, is that right?
In West Berlin, about half a mile from the wall, which means I could see the wall from my kitchen window.
Can you, for those of us who either have not been to Germany or have not couldn't imagine what that time was like, explain a little bit about what that was like living in that era, growing up during the time of these separation of these two different, seemingly different countries that are united by a common history?
Well, I mean, people have to imagine that what is called the Iron Curtain actually is, which goes through Europe. It was the border between West and East Germany at the time, and in particular, the little island that was within East Germany, which was the western sector of Berlin. And so East and West Berlin in 1961 were divided by this wall. To sort of to cut a long story short, the main reason being an enormous brain drain from East Germany, where we had like in the 1950s about 300,000 people moving out from East Germany through the loophole of West Berlin, which had a special status, the four power status, sort of a commonly administered mandate. And until the construction of the wall, people could pass through sort of the checkpoint Charlie, for example, in between East and West Berlin, and could live in the West. And in order to stop that, the wall was built in August, the 13th of August, 1961, and that of course stopped that movement, but hardened, of course, the ideological Cold War during that time. The interesting thing, having lived in Berlin, is that well, the 1960s was a very sort of hard period for all Berliners who had family on the other side of the wall. But very well remembered is the visit of John F. Kennedy in Berlin with his famous speech, "I am a Berliner." That was very much appreciated, obviously. But the fact is that East Germans and East Berliners could or were able to watch West German television, so they were not actually cut off from the other side. And equally, that was one of my experiences when I grew up, that I was able to watch East German television and listen to international radio stations like American Forces Network Radio, Radio France Internationale, BBC, World Service. So I grew up with sort of a view that you can have several perspectives on things. And I think that the same thing is true for the East Germans, who of course did receive sort of propaganda messages over and over again. But the key issue, which I think was underestimated by the East German government, was the ability of civil society to remain in contact and to intensify contact with the other side. And in particular, after the sort of rapprochement policy by then Chancellor Brandt in the 1970s, with a number of treaties which were signed, among others, the so-called quadripartite agreement, which allowed West Berliners and West Germans to go to East Germany, at least for short visits. But that led to a very sort of a steep increase in contacts between people. And even though this was very strongly monitored, it helped sort of prepare the atmosphere for the 1980s, where we are now. This film takes place in 1979. I think the original escape tentatives, and so that was already an era where contacts had been established and where people knew on both sides, if they were interested, what was happening on the other side. But the differences of the economy, of the political system, of the military system, they were just very confrontational and very different.
Berlin is known for being one of these most exciting cities in Europe. It's an arts and culture capital. It's a party town. It's rich with history. And many people certainly have gone and visited in the last 30 years. I wonder if you could share a little bit what was visiting East Berlin like for you, being able to see, being half a mile from the wall and seeing it out of your kitchen window. When you did have an opportunity to go to the other side of the wall, help us feel like we were there. What was that like?
Well, to a certain extent, it was like a time tunnel. If you went through the border checkpoint, the buildings, the colors, the shops, they all sort of reminded me of pictures which I had seen of the 1950s, of also a West German situation, and a number of still impacts from the Second World War, were reminiscent anywhere where you went, in any street, except some of the big streets which were used for army presentations and so on. Well, the atmosphere was I think, if you describe the pace of life in West Berlin and East Berlin, you had the impression that things were slower in East Berlin, that people, well, did not seem to have a goal where to head to, or they were not pressed to do something urgently. Then conversations with people were very cautious because there was this famous secret service, the Stasi, which had a lot of informants in civil society as well. And so, for example, one of the things, when as a Westerner you went to a restaurant, you were always assigned a table. You could not choose a table. And very often, frequently actually, there were already people sitting at that table, mostly also people from East Berlin, or not other West German tourists, but very significantly, you were placed with others from East Germany. So this, of course, raised, with sort of a little knowledge about what was going on, the suspicion that these people were there to listen a little bit what Westerners are talking about, and maybe try to link up with them in some manner. My personal experience was, however, quite nice. I always had sort of relatively superficial but nice conversations with people, and did never have any problems afterwards. Although I must admit, I have never actively searched for my Stasi file, which I might probably have somewhere. And maybe that's one thing I'll do after I retire, to look that up.
That sounds like it would be a great project. You might be afraid of what they write about you. We talk about, in Balloon in particular, we follow the Streisig and Wetzel families in 1979, who want to defect from the east to the west, and they do so by building in secret a hot air balloon. I wonder if you remember, this is based on a story. I wonder if you remember this case in particular at all, and if so, what you recall about that. But also, that was, I mean, living in South Florida. Obviously, there's a large community of Cubans and Venezuelans and people who've exiled from other authoritarian regimes or communist regimes. And so we've heard a lot of stories of how people have left in different ingenious ways. I wonder if you could share maybe a little bit about the balloon experience, what you remember about it, but maybe some other stories of how ingenious ways that Berliners or Germans went from the east to the west.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there have been thousands of attempts to escape, and actually most of them in rather non-spectacular ways. The most intelligent one being to travel to an associated socialist country, like Hungary, for example, or so, which had a border to Austria. And especially in the end of the 1980s, this was, of course, a very successful thing done by many people. But indeed, some were more spectacular than others. I mean, even in the first days of the wall sometimes cut off really the same street, or even that the house, the front of a house was sort of the border. And people, there are pictures still of people jumping out of the third floor or so of their apartment to jump to the western side, even elderly person. So that was already quite dramatic. And I think during the 1960s, you had a number of people who tried to escape by being hidden in a car, which were sort of on a transit to West Germany. Many were discovered, but a few were not, because they had ingeniously sort of constructed the motor in a way that there was enough place to hide. And others did it, for example, with rubber boats, since you have the Baltic Sea as a common border where you had to go from A to B. And even by swimming. There are some who escaped by swimming through the Baltic Sea. And I remember also one, but maybe there have been several of those cases where people escape with trucks loaded, for example, with frozen food or things like that, which also unfortunately happens still today with some trafficking organizations. But well, altogether, I think there have been like 5,000 attempts like this, but there have been many arrests, and there have been even those people who were not directly trying to escape, but who were found to be sort of helpers in the background, were arrested. So you had about 70,000 people or so in jail for attempt to flee from the GDR.
And what was life like for those who did make it across, who were successful in defecting and settling in West Berlin? Were they welcomed by the society in the West? What was that kind of process of adaptation like?
Well, I think it was in the 1970s that the West German government established sort of a welcoming mechanism with an organization specifically designed to help East Germans integrate into society. I think the cases vary very much. There were also people who were so frustrated about the difficulties in the West because they could not adapt to the pace, to the economic requirements and so on, that they went back. So that happened also. But most of them, I think, integrated in a rather non-spectacular manner. But none of those in the 1970s, at least, grew to be a very sort of well-known personality or VIP. That only happened after unification, where you had, of course, then many people who also changed their home from east to west and vice versa, to have a sort of a mixed experience. Yeah, I think it must have been quite a challenge for people used to a planned economy, and where the state tells you everything you do, where your children are being taken care of in daycare centers, etc. And in West Germany, all these, so the social network did not exist to that extent at the time. So if, for example, father and mother of a family tried to work at the same time, they had a difficult time caring for their children at the same time. So yeah, I would say number of various individual developments there.
One of the reasons we're showing this film is, one, to be able to share it with our audiences here in South Florida. As a film, it's very suspenseful and interesting, but it's based on a true story, and it's representative of tens of thousands of people who had a desire to leave from the East and the West, but also because this year marks the 30th anniversary of reunification. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what that process was like. If we're starting in '89, when the Berlin Wall is coming down, and everything that's kind of leading up to bringing the Berlin Wall down, and all of a sudden, you know, it's one Germany. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the environment in society and in politics of that era that kind of led to that moment and what came after?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of precursors to this opening of the wall, which went unnoticed, or which we know in hindsight that they played a role, like foundation of Solidarność movement in Poland, sort of to develop a certain alternative type of socialism. The opening with perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union in 1986 with Mikhail Gorbachev at the time. And then we had some triggering factors which were in East Germany itself. We had, in early 1989, we had some sort of elections which were openly, visibly rigged, and that created a number of protests in the street. And many of human rights activists who had been working secretly beforehand or in church, hidden in churches, they now more openly went to the street and protested. And that movement increased. And then at the same time, there was also a sort of opening of Hungary in particular. In mid-1989, there was sort of an official fence-cutting procedure between Austria and Hungary, which motivated many GDR persons to go to Hungary and then escape through Austria without any major difficulty. And we had this movement of asylum seekers in West German embassies in Prague, in Warsaw, and Budapest, which was successfully concluded in the end by the permission to take transit trains to West Germany. That was negotiated by our then Foreign Minister Genscher, and the end of September that was. Then we had a little curious celebration of the 40th anniversary of the existence of East Germany on the 7th of October, '89, with Gorbachev being invited and telling the East German government who does not adapt will be punished by life, or something similar to that. And then things went relatively fast with increasing demonstrations in the streets. And the day of the 9th of November was sort of a caricature of worst case scenario of what can happen if everything goes wrong. From the East German bureaucracy perspective, because I don't know, remember there was a press conference of the meeting of the Politburo, and a member of the Politburo who had not been present at the meeting was chosen to present the decisions of that meeting, which did concern a major issue, namely the provision on how to facilitate travel to the West. And so there was already sort of a reformist trend in these days, but unfortunately, this man who presented it did not quite have a total grasp of the issue, and actually he had a two-page press release and only looked at the first page, not at the second. And the second page continued the entry into force moment, and he announced publicly on television that actually he thought it was immediately. So that meant the message came through also on Western television, watched by East Germans and East Berliners. You can now go to the border and you can go directly have a beer in West Berlin, and no one will hold you up. And that created this mass movement, which has been widely publicized in the media. And finally, at the same time, all the other Politburo members had gone into hiding somewhere. I don't know whether they were so tired of the day, but they were not reachable apparently. And no one recognized the dramatic character of the situation. So it was up to the border guards to take a decision. And they were overwhelmed by thousands of people showing up at the same time at the border, and finally let them go. And there was no going back from that. And then, well, a very difficult year followed of negotiations, of determination of what kind of unification there was going to be. And one of the key issues was, of course, to create also on the Western European side the impression that there was a new German superpower emanating from all this. But it was made very clear, and I think that is one of the greatest strategic decisions by Helmut Kohl at the time, the chancellor, who made a 10-point plan for unification, that he was aware that you had to seize this moment to end this process to bring it to an end, unification, but it can only be done with the four victorious power of World War II, including the Russians, the Americans, French, and British. And that was concluded by the so-called 2+4 treaty, which ended also the quadripartite status of Berlin and made Germany more than 40 years after the end of World War II, a sovereign nation altogether. But with the engagement and we have a very renowned and recognized constitution, the so-called Basic Law, which places human dignity and human rights really on a very high pedestal. And European integration is also sort of part of this German DNA, which actually has been so since the 1950s, since the Rome Treaty of 1957, actually. So with that all together, and we had the difficulty of bringing two completely different economic systems together. East Germany was basically bankrupt. It had already borrowed in the 1980s from West Germany, got some loans and so on. But there were about 1.5 million de facto unemployed people who were employed officially in the state, so, okay, with the actualization, so they had to be absorbed somehow and retrained to be sort of an efficient member of the overall German economy. There was also a decisive moment when monetary union was decided, because the value of East German currency did not correspond to the Deutschmark, the West German currency. On the black market, it was like a 1 to 10 relationship. You could get 10 East German mark for 1 West German. But finally, for very strategic and political reasons, it was decided that most of the transfers would be done at a 1 to 2 and 1 to 1 ratio, which allowed also for many East Germans to sort of have some startup money to get going in the new environment, which I think was a very minimal but very necessary gesture at that time. And then, of course, you had the political question of should this be a sort of a discussion about political contents of the constitution, or as some people have interpreted it, a takeover of East Germany by West Germany. Now, the fact is that since West Germany at the time was sort of the recognized model also by the vast majority of East Germans, and at the same time, during that year, we had the World Soccer Championship, which was won by Germany, then still West Germany.
Right.
But that helped a sort of a spirit of a team, sort of a team spirit of East and West Germans. And that helped cover up some of these underlying psychological issues, which you can still, with some people here today, that they felt a little bit overrun by history, that it went so fast, and there was not really the time to discuss sort of the positive elements of the day-to-day life and of policy and ideology that could have been sort of integrated in the new Germany. So you still have this these discussions, but all over. If you look at it now, 30 years later, I think it was an unprecedented success of combining two very different political, economic, and military systems in a very difficult environment. And that this transformation has also led to a European-wide economic growth. I think the German unification in the first couple of years added at least 0.5% or 1% of GDP to the other European countries' GDP.
Amazing.
So basically, I would still say today a big success story with a number of course, individual sort of psychological, economic, and also political points which you can still discuss and which are still being debated today.
It's bittersweet for me to be talking about this. It was 2020. I was going to go to Berlin this year. I've been very, very excited about it, and I can't wait for the world to kind of return to some normalcy so that I can make that visit. Just kind of in wrapping up in our discussion, kind of from a historical perspective. I mean, to the point that you just made, 30 years is something to celebrate, but it's not that long ago, and obviously the ramifications of old ways of thinking, of old ways of living, of old ways of being ruled. You don't get rid of those or adapt to those in just 2 or 3 decades. What, for somebody like myself who has never been to Berlin, never been to Germany, what is it like now? Can you still, whether it's physically or culturally, do you still feel a divide of any sense between East and West, or what was East and West, I should say?
Well, I mean, as a Berliner, I can still, of course, distinguish where the wall was at the time and what is sort of on the other side. But in particular in Berlin, this is being blurred enormously with a movement and attraction, as you said, of young people coming from everywhere in the world to flood sort of Berlin housing market, which is booming, and renting is becoming extremely expensive in Berlin. But you can see it more in the rural areas or in the smaller towns in East Germany, or closer to the Polish border, for example. You can see also rather also in the political debate. You can see it. There is sort of the political trends or attitudes, for example, towards migrants. It's quite interesting to see that those remote rural areas of former GDR are more sort of apprehensive of migrants coming to Germany than, although they have never seen anyone because they're not there, and they've heard about it in the media. But so there is a little bit of what we are now discussing quite frequently with social media. Some conspiracy theories and so on are being developed, unfortunately. And the media competence, I would say, in many parts of the population is not very developed. Maybe technically they're even better than you and me in using different apps and so on. But in order to sort of to distill the essence of messages and evaluate their context, I think there is a big work for governments to do to fill that gap.
30 years is a long time, and it's our recent history is as important as our old history, I think. So we're so delighted to be able to present Balloon to our audiences here in South Florida. Enjoy it as a piece of cinema, and I think you'll find it a very exciting and thrilling piece of cinema. Enjoy it as a piece of history representative of a time when Germany was divided, but for the last 3 decades, it's been unified, and it's been sharing its culture, its history, its influence and its power with the world. And we're so fortunate here in Miami to have the Consul General doing so much to support and promote Germany and the German people and the German culture and industries. Thank you so much, Mr. Siegel. Is there anything you would like to say to viewers of the film or to South Florida's German community?
Well, of course, in this time of Corona, people are rather sewing masks rather than balloons, but sort of that brings us also together, the two topics. And so I wish everyone who's been able to see this film enjoy it, and maybe in a couple of weeks or months we'll have the opportunity to discuss in private, but really in sort of in real proximity to if there are any questions which emanate from that. But I think it's a very enjoyable film, and it depicts a story which is unfortunately quite real.
Thank you so much. For those of you watching, just a reminder, you can see the film for free at Adult Cinema's website, courtesy of the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany in Miami, till Sunday, May 31st at midnight. So log in anytime before then, and you'll be able to see the film, and hopefully you'll be able to watch this conversation and share it with your friends. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mr. Siegel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.